Fontaine Arcane Quest was one of the peaks of Genshin's writing, with its tale building from the criticisms and blocks from years and years ago. However, today I want to do a deeper dive into the themes present in this story, because what makes this Arcane Quest fascinating is that it challenges several established status quos from Genshin's lore, making us question what we know and what we don't. And when a franchise is 3 years old and it starts questioning its own consistency, that's when you know that the story is really getting good. Disclaimer, this is less of a theory or speculation and more so an introspective look into how the Arcane Quest actually rewrites the entire tale of Genshin, at least from the perspectives of multiple sides of the story. Take this more like a literary criticism instead of an actual concrete lore video, but nevertheless, I hope that you guys enjoy. And I hope that this video allows you to look into the lore with a different perspective in mind. So what did it challenge? Number one, it challenged the idea that the Fatui are inherently bad narratively. The Arcane Quest challenged the idea that the Fatui are supposed to be the enemies in the major Arcane Quests. Obviously, in World Quests, they're more amicable with several Fatui agents being our personal allies. But in the main storyline, they served as the main adversaries, which isn't a bad thing, but with that preconceived notion, the Fontaine Arcane Quest made it to the point to counteract that idea that the Fatui have to be the perpetrator of the problem. And I'm really happy about that. They were active allies throughout the story, and the quest even makes it a point to victimize them by blaming them for crimes they didn't commit. What I really like about this aspect is that it recontextualizes the Fatui as characters and as an organization. The Fontaine Arcane Quest also emphasizes the nuance of the relationship with humanity as being sometimes unknown allies in the shadows. They're not good by any means, but they're not inherently here to take over the world just like that, which is a very good thing because it adds a new perspective. It paints the Fatui in a more complex light when you consider their motivations, and as the forefront harbinger of the Arcane Quest, Arlecchina became all the more mysterious with how previous warnings that the Traveler received about her are now being tested. Overall, the Fontaine Arcane Quest really challenged the idea that Fatui equals bad tenfold, and I'm pleasantly and happily proven wrong. What I also like about this perspective is that it goes out of this way to humanize Lyney, Lynette, Freminet, Tartaglia, and even Arlecchino at some point. I also like the fact that they also added some political tension between Fontaine and the Fatui, which I really think should be done in more Arcane Quests. Number 2, it challenged the concept that the story needs an active antagonist. Having an antagonist simplifies a story, and the previous Arcane Quests had a clear antagonist that needed to be apprehended. An example of an exemption to this is the Liyue Arcane Quest, which did not have a concrete antagonist since Childe's antagonistic role played in the later stages of the story, but he was nevertheless an adversary somewhere along the lines considering that we were never really meant to trust him. But the Fontaine Arcane Quest challenged the idea that there's a concrete bad guy instead of circumstance being the problem. It showed that Fontaine was being put in a difficult situation and that inherently it was nobody's fault. There is an antagonist, sure, in the form of the whale, but the whale isn't the central focus of the story's core for justice and instead an instrument of circumstance. The reason that I like this analysis is that not all stories need to have a bad guy or even just an antagonist. Sometimes life just happens, and there is a lot of character nuance that you can play with when it comes to just people having to deal with problems that could have come out of nowhere. We see characters have to deal with natural disasters and actually try to put a human sentiment around it, by one either blaming the Archon or even blaming themselves or just having a different perspective that it is what it is. That nuance of not having someone to completely blame for the problems that are happening in your country is actually very human and a very interesting perspective when it comes to the story. And I'm really happy that the Fontaine Arcane Quest isn't so black and white. Number 3 is that it challenged the relationship of the Archons to the 7 Sovereigns. This one was a massive lore challenge because up until this point, the 7 Sovereigns, or the dragons of the old world, were seen as somewhat of an antagonistic force to Celestia, but they symbolize an old world order that was antithetical to not only Celestia, but also humanity. But the Arcane Quest showed us a new perspective of the Archons' roles as the unwilling colonizers. If you don't know, according to the lore, Teyvat was ruled by the 7 Sovereigns, or the Bishops, or the Dragons, and Phanis came here and waged war against them and essentially created a new world order by defeating the 7 Sovereigns. So of course, the Archons don't have a say in the grander actions of Celestia, but by association, they don't exactly have the natural authority. But in the lore, there was this blanket of Archons equals good, Dragons equals bad subtext present in how the ancient texts describe the relationship of the gods and the sovereigns. But the Fontaine Arcane Quest challenges the legitimacy of the Archon's rulership over Teyvat, with Fossilor returning Neuvlet's power to him as a final act of justice. I also like what Fossilor said in the lore, that this power was not necessarily hers to begin with, so isn't it justice for her to give it back to Neuvillette, aka its rightful owner. Furthermore, this actually shows us that because of the relationship between Fossilor and Neuvillette, there could have been an amicable relationship that could have blossomed between the gods and the dragons, but just didn't, where both parties co-ruled Tevat. Of course, Celestia was invaders to the land, which would only make war precedented at the time, and Neuvillette is also a reincarnation instead of the active dragon from millennia ago. We do need to consider that circumstance, but the storyline present really challenged the line between new versus old by adding a harmonious relationship. I think that dynamic is very interesting considering, again, they were supposed to be mortal enemies according to the lore, and Tevat was never meant to be Celestia's. And building from that, it challenged the rule of the Archons in general. The Archons remained uncontested for the past 4 Archon quests as rightful heirs to their nation. Most of the time, they had to battle a problem when it came to what was happening in their country. While they had their faults and flaws, they ultimately still ended up being the gods of their respective nation, which only gives us more lore about the transition of power between the Archons during the war, which I'm really excited for if they're going to dive deeper into that. The Archon War is one of the most mysterious aspects of Genshin's lore, and I don't think that anything in the lore at the moment has completely explained what was going on and what were the motivations of that war in the first place. So I'm really interested to see how that's going to turn out. I really like that this Archon quest went out of its way to truly ask if the Archons are really meant to be the rulers of Tevat, or if it would have been just to give the powers back to the original rulers. This was actually also opened with Nahida and Aphep, and just built up with the Fontaine Archon quest. Another one that I'm slightly going to mention is that I believe that the Fontaine Archon quest achieved what the Inazuma Archon quest didn't, the theme of revolution and the confrontation of an Archon, which is why I believe that the Fontaine Archon quest is proof that Genshin has come a long way from their previous methods of storytelling, especially in main story quests, and not lore-based storytelling. Those two are very different. Overall, I really like the idea that the Fontaine Archon quest challenge a lot of things in the status quo of Genshin, considering that it's the midpoint of the story, so we're going to need to see something special. But even if it challenged something, it also reinforced several themes that I want to point out. Number 1 is a theme of duality in Genshin with Furina and Fossilor. The theme of duality has been consistent between the Archons, sans Zhongli for unknown reasons. Venti and the Unknown Bard, Ian Makoto, Rukkhadevta, and Nahida, though it can also be looked at in the perspective of Archon rulership of the land being the duality, so something like Venti and Istaroth and Zhongli and Guizhong, so maybe that can also come into play with that, but it did establish the theme of pairs, which is something that has been consistent in the lore. I know that a lot of people have been saying that, oh, not again, this is another part of the Genshin story, that we're going to have 2 Archons secretly, but it is a motif that is present from the very beginning, so it is what it unfortunately is. And number 2 is that it consistently builds on the idea that the heavenly principles are not to be trusted. Celestia has consistently been scrutinized by the lore for their questionable actions in order to maintain order, but this is the first time we've seen an Archon in their own quest actively plot against the heavenly principles. And not just plot, Fossilor was able to relinquish the throne of the Hydro Archon, which is very fascinating. We have never seen that in lore before. The most that we have seen is a slight rebellion from Venti and Zhongli, so this in its own way is upping the stakes when it comes to godhood, which I'm so interested, because the heavenly principles are not to be trusted. Celestia has not given us a reason to actually trust them, and considering everything else, I'm really interested with what they have for Natlan. Now, what could it have done better? The Archon quest is not perfect, God knows it's not perfect, so obviously I'm going to be giving my criticisms. Number 1 is that the long tedious quest of Act 3 needs to be cut down. I think that they really hammered in the idea of being in prison very well, though I think that honestly fetch quests like that, especially since we're already repeating dialogue from Paimon, means that we're going to need to be cutting down content for the sake of not only runtime, but also for pacing reasons, considering that it was very long. Number 2 was while Arlecchino was a red herring, I think having her play a bigger role would have established her better as a character. The Fatui Harbinger wasn't the focus of the story, as she shouldn't be, but I wanted to at least have a separate chat with her regarding her reasons for helping out Fontaine or her agenda with the House of the Hearth. Again, prior to the Fontaine Archon quest, Arlecchino had a reputation from Tartaglia and Wanderer that she was batshit insane. And while they're not the most credible of sources, I actually do think that Arlecchino is a very complex character to begin with, and I wish that we could have talked with her more. I think that she had a really strong point when she called out Furina in the beginning. And speaking of that, number 3 is that I wish that they delved a little deeper into the feud between Farina and the people of Fontaine. This is a very good plot point that unfortunately only got glossed over during the final parts of the Arcan quest. I think they could have dived deeper into the idea of humanity fighting against their god when they feel that they've been wronged. The whole trial sequence was absolutely fantastic. What's good about the Fontaine Arcan quest is that while we understand the sacrifice that Farina made for Fontaine, it's not like the people of Fontaine were also in the wrong for demanding for Farina's attention, who is their Archon and their government's figurehead, to do more. A lot of people have misconstrued that the people of Fontaine should apologize or were in the wrong for doing that to Farina, when in reality, they were just as scared and horrified of the flood that had already taken numerous lives. And in their eyes, Farina wasn't doing the bare minimum of even discussing the matter of the emergency publicly, which is a very red flag for your government. Imagine getting an earthquake but the news never covers it, or there isn't any established protocols for evacuation, and that this earthquake already killed several people. Arlecchino's anger is very much warranted because it looks like the people had to mobilize themselves to get things done for the evacuation. The House of the Hearth and the Spina de Rosula did wonders for the entirety of Fontaine during the evacuation protocols, while Risley, Colorant, and Nervalet got their chances to shine in Act 4, which only showed you the gravity of the situation that, at the time, Farina wasn't addressing properly and publicly. The people were rightfully pissed, and I wish that they had a bit more dialogue with that, though I think that the story handled it well enough that it's not a glaring criticism of the Arcan quest. Arlecchino and Navia served as the people's conduit properly, and the story didn't necessarily gloss over it, which is good. Anyway, that's my final thoughts for the Fontaine Arcan quest, as well as my personal analysis of just the themes of contradiction that are present and just how it challenges the current status quo of Genshin's lore. Anyway, my name is Aster, and thank you for chilling with me. Goodbye!